Well, open up your Bibles, if you would, to John chapter 4. This is a lady that we have talked about a lot just because there's so many things connected to her. And if you're still learning your way around the Bible, know there's an Old Testament and a New Testament. The Old Testament starts with Genesis, and the New Testament starts with Matthew, and John is in the New Testament. It's the fourth book. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the New Testament. You say, what's the difference? Well, in the simplest way to describe it, the Old Testament is before the birth of Jesus, and the New Testament is from the birth of Jesus on. So John chapter 4. And we're starting a new series today called Vital. And the reason is because we're going to talk about something that's vital in our life and vital in our relationship with God. It's kind of a part of who we are, who we were made to be. We're going to talk about worship. And I know that whenever we hear the word worship, there's not anything in it that's just really exciting. You know, if I said, hey, we're going to have a worship seminar, people aren't going to be like, hey, let's show up and go there, you know. So I get that. But I want to just help us know what it is, because it is such a vital part of our relationship with God. Have you ever thought about this, that the way that you and I are made, that we really are we were designed as instruments of worship? When you think about this, in other words, you know, that we were given, you know, a mouth so that we can declare the goodness of God and so that we can be an encouragement to people. We were given eyes so that we could see the broken places in people's world that God sees, and we could reach into that world. We were given hands so that we could serve God's purpose into the lives of other people and also raise them up as an act of surrender to our Father. We were given feet so that God's plan could carry us into other people's lives and we could be a part of helping them. And all those are acts of worship. And so we're going to look at a situation today where Jesus had this conversation. He met this lady, and she wasn't really churchy. And maybe that's you. Maybe you're not churchy. So you may identify with this lady, you know, that all of us have broken places in our life. But the truth of the matter is, if you're churchy, you kind of learn how to hide them. And so she wasn't churchy, so she didn't know the game, how to hide them. And her and Jesus had this conversation. It was pretty cool. So he's going to go through an area called Samaria. And Jesus is a Jew, and she was a Samaritan. And the Jews and the Samaritans didn't like each other. They didn't for centuries, there had been this adversarial relation, this tension, you know, and even, you know, conflict militarily, or them letting the enemy of the other one use their place as kind of a launching pad and that kind of thing. So it was just real tension. So much so that many times Jews would intentionally avoid going through Samaria. They would take a longer trip so they didn't have to dirty themselves with the Samaritans. That's how much they despised them. So Jesus, but he goes through this area and he sits down at this well in the middle of the day, and this woman shows up with a pitcher full of water. And so she's going to fill it up with water, and when she shows up there, Jesus says, hey, would you get me something to drink? Well, automatically she recognizes that he's a Jew, and she said, why would you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan, to get you some water? And so they begin to have this conversation, and Jesus tells her, he says, look, if you knew who it was that was talking to you, you would ask him for living water, and he would give that to you. And so, in other words, he was telling her, look, if you really knew who I am, it would change the questions you ask. And so they're having this conversation, and he says, if you drink the water that I give you, you won't thirst anymore. In other words, declaring in her world that she'd had this thirst, and she was trying to fill it with something. And then he said to her, he said, go get your husband. And she said, well, I've been married. I don't have a husband. And he said, you're right. You're living with a guy now. He's not your husband. You've been married 5 times. In other words, he was saying, looks like you've been trying to quench this thirst with relationships, and that really hasn't been working for you. So they're having this conversation, and as they're going, we'll pick up through that, from that part of the conversation on. John chapter 4, verse 19. The woman says this, sir, the woman said, you must be a prophet. Tell me, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship, while we Samaritans claim it is here at Mount Gerizim, where our ancestors worshipped? So, again, she's drawn that distinction. She's a Samaritan. The Samaritans say we're supposed to worship here, and the Jews say we're supposed to worship in Jerusalem. And for those of you that care about like the history of it, let me give you just a little historical thing for a minute. At one time, the kingdom of Israel was just it was a north and south kingdom that was united. Like David was king over all of that. Solomon was king over all of that. But as time went on, the kingdom split, and the northern kingdom kind of began to backslide. And as they began to backslide, then eventually they were invaded, and they began to mingle with people that were like worshiping, like were involved in pagan religions. And so their form of religion kind of became diluted. They believed in the first 5 books of the Old Testament and then a bunch of other stuff from other religions that were mixed in there. Well, the southern kingdom stayed true, and so they didn't like the northern kingdom, which became the Samaritans, because they viewed them as compromisers, as people that had kind of walked away from their heritage, their tradition, and God's calling for their life. So the woman who's a Samaritan said, we Samaritans think you're supposed to worship here, and you Jews think you're supposed to worship there. And so it seems like you're a prophet, so would you tell me which one we're supposed to worship at? And Jesus said this. Jesus replied, believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father. Everybody say the Father. Whether you worship the Father on this mountain, in other words, where we are, or in Jerusalem. So she's having this encounter because all her life, she was raised to believe that worship was something that took place at a place, and if you're going to do it right, it takes place at this place. And that she knew there was a contention between her people and the Jews, because the Jews said, no, it doesn't happen here, it happens there. And Jesus was letting her know, you know what? You're both wrong. Because he wanted her to know that worship is not about a where, it's about a who. So in other words, it's not one of those things that worship is, you're worshiping when you're here at this place, or you're worshiping when you're there at that place. He said the time is coming when it doesn't matter whether you worship the Father, the object of our worship, whether you worship him here or there. And so what he was letting her know that, that it's not about this place, it's not about where it takes place. Because I would bet you that back then that they struggled with the same thing that we struggle with today. And often when we talk about worship, we view that as something that takes place at church. And like in our culture, a lot of times worship, when we talk about worship, we're talking about the time that we're all singing. Now, man, I'm grateful that we have musically gifted people. Aren't you glad we have people that can sing and stuff like that? Yeah. And you know what I ought to do? One Sunday, I ought to lead worship, and you'd really be grateful for them. So I'm telling you right now. But here's the deal, is that I think that we lose sight of the fact that worship it's not just singing. That worship is really it's a declaration of worth. It's worthship. If it was defined by where it happened at, then it would just be an event, and we would only be obligated to do it when we were at that place. But because it's not about a place, it's about a person, that wherever we go, we're called to declare God's worth in our life. Now, when I say this, it can get a little weird because people automatically, so sometimes people have taken that to mean that everywhere we go, we're supposed to be preaching and stuff like that. And no, that's not what I'm saying at all. What I am saying that every day in our world that we're faced with a decision that we get to declare where God's at in our life. When I was out there a little while ago, it's sprinkling. When I woke up this morning, man, it was just, the kind of cloudy. And I kind of like, oh, man, babe, I'd really like to sleep in. She's like, well, you're the pastor. You kind of really need to go. And so, so that really didn't happen. But I know that for some of you, that may be the conversation that you have. But you made a decision today to show up. In other words, that many of you are here because you decided today that whatever else decision you made, that coming here was a way to honor God, and that was more important than the other thing that you had to do. Now, let me just say this. When we start talking this way, if we're not careful, we can get real legalistic and real rigid. I'm not saying you can't ever miss church. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just pointing out that on a regular basis, you and I, that we're faced with those situations where we have to make a decision like, God, am I going to do what declares how important you are in my life? In other words, because you really matter, I could do this, but because you really matter, I'm going to do this instead. Tomorrow you're going to go out there in your Monday world. And for some of you, it doesn't look anything like the world you're sitting in right now. And you're going to be faced with options, opportunities to make decisions. And if you view worship as a place, that it's what I do on Sunday morning when I show up at Cedar Point, then it really doesn't come into play because you're not there. But if your worship is about declaring God's value in your life and in your world, then that begins to impact the choices that you'll make in your Monday world. Because for you, worship is not about where you're at, it's about who you're with. And you're with the Father. That God, if you've made Jesus Lord of your life, then He's your Father. And He goes with you wherever you go. He goes with me wherever you go. And so we do this. If it's about a place, then it becomes this religious activity. You know, and we've talked about that before, that Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. And so, you know, we're not here, you know, a win for us is not to introduce you to a religion, it's to introduce you to a real relationship with Jesus. We want to connect you in our life groups. We want you to discover your gift. That's one of the reasons why we do Growth Track after the 12:02 service. We feed you, do childcare, because we want to help you discover and connect and be introduced to and all those kind of things. And so, you know, religion is just, it's rules. And religion is based upon, I hope I don't get caught. You know what religion is like? And that is that we all know, you know, I'm driving down the road, and I don't know if you've noticed it or not, but they have suggested speeds that they think you should drive when you're driving down the road. Does anybody notice those? And so sometimes I disagree with them. Sometimes I'm like, I know they say 50, but this feels like a 60-mile road to me. And so you know, I'm driving down the road, and from time to time, up ahead, I'll see a car that has lights on it. And they haven't engaged yet, and I'm like, you know what? I think I'm going to take their suggestion and slow down to 50 miles an hour. Now, I don't do this because I don't want to disappoint them. From time to time, I haven't slowed down quick enough, and they turn those lights on, and they begin to escort me to a nice stop. And so when they show up, I'm not like, I'm so sorry I disappointed you. I can't believe I did that. No, you know what I'm thinking? Like, I really don't want a ticket. You know, that's what I'm thinking right there in that moment. Now, let me just say this. I'm grateful for our law enforcement. I'm grateful for what they do when they show up. Man, I roll down my window. I show my hands because I know that they're walking up to a situation every time. They never know who they're dealing with. And so, I'm grateful for them. But I'll just be real transparent with you that many times that doesn't come into play when I'm making a decision about how fast I'm going to drive. That's what religion is like. Religion isn't, I don't want to do this because you matter so much to me. Religion is, I don't want to do this because if you catch me, you're going to be real mad at me. I'm going to pay a price. A relationship is, I don't want to do this because I care about you. I mean, if you really love your wife, you know that there's times that you're away from her and you'll make choices. Not because you're afraid that she would find, if you did the other, you make choices because you love her. That's because you're in a relationship with her. Well, our relationship with God is the same way, that when we understand that it's not an event that takes place, that it's not this religious activity, but it's because the Father's come into our world because He's rescued us. Because of Jesus, we've been rescued from our brokenness. We've been forgiven. But then we make decisions not because we're afraid He's going to be mad at us if we don't do the right thing, but we make decisions because we love Him, because we're grateful. So first of all, worship, number one is this, if you're taking notes. Worship is not about the where, it's about the who. Where do you worship? Who do you worship? And you know, that you declare God's worth to you. So it's not just when I come here, but when I go to work or at home in my community, it's important. And so it's not a place, it's all of those things. So let's continue reading there. So he said, Jesus replied, "Believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans know very little about the one you worship, while we Jews know all about him, for salvation comes through the Jews. But the time is coming, indeed it's here now, when true worshipers," everybody say true worshipers. When true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him that way, for God is spirit, so those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So Jesus said a lot in this little paragraph right here. And he said, first of all, to her as a Samaritan, he said, you guys have really, you've kind of gotten diluted with some of the things that you used to know. You don't know everything you used to know, so you don't really know him as well as the Jews do. And so he was connecting worship to be something that's connected to how well we know the Father, how well we know him, how well, what our relationship with him is like. And as I said earlier, that when we really know him, then many times that should cause me to step away from things, not because I'm afraid of what he'll do to me if I make mistakes, but because he matters to me. And he said this, he said, true worship looks like this. So for him to say that there's true worship must imply also that there's worship that really isn't true or genuine or sincere. What does true worship look like? He said there's two qualities to true worship. He said it's done in spirit and in truth. Now, I'll be real transparent with you. This is one of those things that I've really tried to nail down over the years, even in preparation for this. But I've done a lot of study, and it's still one of those things that it's kind of hard to just kind of put a fence around as to what that looks like. But when he talked about in spirit, that really he was letting us know that it's not a performance-based thing, that it's this thing that comes from our heart, that it's genuine. Now, David and Jamie Brace are my friends, and if you know the Braces, that time that you've ever been over their house, they used to have this song, and I think their daughter Avery has it now, called Jax. And whenever you would go to the house, man, I knew when I came to that house, if Jax was out, that I could try to talk to David and Jamie all day long, but the first 5 minutes of my time was going to be connected to acknowledging that Jax was there. Because Jax would come, man, I mean, the minute he would get in front of you, he would jump up and down. I mean, he could really jump. I mean, he would jump in almost like to face level, like, hey, look at me. Hey, I'm over here. Hey, I'm glad you're here. Hey, it's good to see you. And I'm like, hey, Jax, how you doing? You know what I mean? And it just took a little time, for Jax to be satisfied that there'd been a recognition there that we know each other, all right? And sometimes my prayer would be like, Lord, make me the man that Jax thinks I am. I mean, that would be the thing that I would pray, And so, so you have this encounter with him. Well, there wasn't anybody behind Jax telling him to recognize me, to value me. It was all genuine and sincere. Nobody had to prompt him into doing it. I knew Jax was glad to see me. You said, well, he's glad to see everybody. You don't know that. Don't say that. I just knew he's glad to see me. He was there. It was a genuine thing. And first of all, the first ingredient of true worship is not done because we feel obligated. Real worship is done. It's done in spirit. In other words, it's like it's coming from my heart. I genuinely mean it, Father. I'm so grateful for you. I'm not doing this because I have to. I'm not doing it because everybody's watching me to see what I'm going to do. Matter of fact, it's so genuine and so real that I only have an audience of one that I want to do it for, and it's you. And then he said, not only is it done in spirit, but it's done in truth. In other words, in a recognition of who God really is, of who Jesus really is. I've said this before, but I think we just have to hang on to it in the world that we live in today, that still the majority of humanity believes in God. And so that's not the problem. When you look at the history of many of the things that have been done to people over time, a lot of it's not been done by agnostics. A lot of it's not been done by atheists. A lot of it's been done by people that claim to believe in God, and so they do things supposedly in His name. And when you see what they've done, it just reveals that they really don't know Him. Because if they really knew Him, they would know that He doesn't want them to do that. I mean, you think about it, 9/11, 2000, in 2001. I mean, that wasn't done by atheists. That was done by people that claimed to know God. And they were doing it in His name. And it's obvious they don't know Him, because if they knew Him, they would know that His plan was not for them to fly a plane into a building. Right? So we worship Him in spirit and in truth. In other words, as we get to know Him, then we begin to worship Him from our core, because we're just grateful for what we know about Him. But as time goes on, the more we know Him, the more grateful we get. And so it just grows in us. It just grows as it becomes more real. And then it says this, it says, the Father's looking for people that worship Him that way. Well, what do you and I look for? Things that are valuable to us. Things that matter. Years ago, when Tina and I had first got in youth ministry, man, we were just, at times it was tough financially. I remember we had some friends in our lives that they'd written us a check over Christmas for it was like $200 or $300. And that was a lot of money to us. It was going to take care of some bills. They just wanted to give it to us. And we just feel led to give this to you. I'm like, oh man, praise God, that's good. And so I had the 75 Torino. And, we were packing stuff and going back to New Mexico, where we'd lived for 17 years, even though I'm from here. And so when we got home, I couldn't find the check. And so, man, I'm tearing out the trunk of the car. I'm looking under the seats. And, this was a youth minister's car, man. So there were like tater tots that had turned green. And I mean, I'd stuff in there from the Ford administration. I mean, just all sorts of, there was just a lot of things in there. And so I couldn't find it. And so I had to do this really humbling thing and call him back and go, hey, that check you gave me? I lost it. I said, okay, we'll stop payment on it. I'm like, okay, good. Hey, Is that all you're going to do? And so they sent us another check. But the reason why I searched for it is because it was so valuable to me. And God loves all of us. There's not anything we can do to get him to love us more than he does right now. You can't say, well, boy, he really loves me now. But there is something about worship that grabs his attention. Whenever it's done from a sincere heart, and it's done from a desire to know what's right and to know what's true, it's like he notices. It's like he sees it. And the beautiful thing about it is that, there are times where we'll talk about this in the next few weeks, that you may have a gift or a thing or something you do, and it's just here. He sees that. He notices that. It gets his attention. Solomon one night, man, he'd taken over his dad's place as king, and so he wanted to start his kingdom out right. So the very thing he did, he began to offer these sacrifices up as an act of worship. And the father noticed. He said, what do you want, man? He said, give me wisdom to deal with these people that you've given me. But his worship got the attention of heaven. In Acts chapter 10, there was a guy, he was a Gentile. He wasn't a Christian at the time, but he was seeking God. And so he prayed and he gave to the poor and he did all these things because he just had a real heart for God. And he worshiped. God sent an angel to him and he said, hey man, your prayers and your giving have gotten heaven's attention. There's these acts of worship that he had done that heaven noticed. So it says the Father looks for this. Well, Jesus was saying to her, he said, you Samaritans, you really don't know him yet, so you really have that kind of connection. We know him better, but true worshipers will worship him this way. And so Jesus was letting her know that your worship is a reflection of your relationship. It's a reflection of where he's at in your life. What place is he at? Where's the worth? Where's his worth in my life will be shown by the decisions that I make. And Jesus said that. Let's look at this last point and we'll close with this. So he said this, he said, the Father's looking for those who will worship him that way, for God is spirit, so those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. The woman said, I know the Messiah is coming, the one who's called Christ. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. Then Jesus told her, I'm the Messiah. And just then his disciples came back and they were shocked to find him talking to a woman. But none of them had the nerve to ask, what do you want with her? Or why are you talking to her? And the woman, listen to this, the woman left her water jar beside the well and ran back to the village telling everyone, come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could he possibly be the Messiah? So the people came streaming from the villages to see him. So again, this encounter began when Jesus sat down at the well and this woman in the middle of the day showed up with her water jar to fill it up with water. And again, culturally, typically people didn't fill their water pots up in the middle of the day. They usually did it early in the morning before it got really, really hot. And so we could speculate as to why she did it. I personally think that maybe because of some of the decisions that she made, she carried shame around. And shame is such a powerful thing, right? You know, the enemy tempts us, the devil tempts us. And then when we yield to temptation, then he causes us to live in shame. And it causes us to draw back from God and draw back to people. I'm convinced there are people that stay home this morning, they don't come to church sometimes because of the shame the devil's put on them. And they think, when I go to church, everybody will just know how bad I've been. Don't buy that lie. So this lady shows up with her water jug and she's going to fill it up. And after this encounter with Jesus, that she's so satisfied by being in his presence that it even changed the reason why she was there. You know, it's like all of us kind of have this imaginary water pot, this imaginary water jug that we carry around with us, and we're constantly trying to fill it up with something. You know, maybe it's with her, it was relationships. She'd been married all these times. She's lived with a guy, and nothing satisfied her. She just kind of kept filling up the jug and kept leaving that place dissatisfied, empty. Maybe that's you for relationships. Maybe other people would show up, and maybe you're looking for accomplishment or achievement, and you keep trying to fill the jug up. Some of you, it's wealth, accumulation of things. Some of you, it's approval and acceptance by people. Maybe for some of you, it's addiction. But it's all these things that are counterfeits and substitutes. And when it's all said and done, they still leave us empty and thirsty and wanting. And she has this conversation with Jesus. And he even talked to her about some of the most painful things in her life. And yet the way that he talked with her about it, she didn't leave there feeling condemned. She didn't leave there feeling guilty or shame. Matter of fact, she left his presence and wanted to share about the encounter that she had with him. And she left her water jug there because her purpose had been revealed. She wasn't there to get her water jug filled. She was there to have an encounter with his presence, and it changed her purpose. Every day as we have an opportunity to declare God's worth, we have encounters with him in his presence, we leave with our vessel a little more full. And as we leave with it full from his presence, then the recognition of these other things, that it's okay if we do them, but to look for them for our personal satisfaction or for them to provide what our purpose is, always leaves us thirsty, always leaves us empty. She has this encounter, and it changed her purpose. Her vessel, for the first time in her life, was full. That's what worship does. Because it's not connected to where we are, even though I believe in coming together as a group of people and celebrating the goodness of God and presence of God. But if this is the only place that it happens, then we've missed what it is. And if we think that it's just when we sing, we've missed what it is. It's when we go out in our lives and we have the opportunity to declare his worth to us. Not because we're afraid of what he'll do if we don't, but because we're grateful of what he's done for us. That's worship. That's worth-ship. That's showing his value and what he's done in our world, in our lives. I want you to bow your heads and close your eyes for just a minute. Let's spend just a moment with God. Just let him speak to you. He'll give you God thoughts. As you begin to talk to him about stuff, you'll just have an awareness that he just putting ideas there. He's giving you thoughts and he's dealing with you and just giving you a sense in your heart and these spiritual nudges and just things like that he'll just do in you. So let's just spend a moment with him right now as you talk to him about and just thank him for how good he's been to you, for what he's done in your life, for the things that he has yet to do.